relationships. And anyway, Muhammad said you can have wives, 2, 3, or 4. I thought it was interesting that he doesn't even mention the option of 1. But it says, and then you can have as many women as your right hand possesses, as many as you take in battle. And so you can have 4 women that have the status of wife, but you can have lots of other women, and so forth. So it was a way that he would work, he would get people to convert, and he would promise them these sensual pleasures. Matter of fact, St. Augustine in 1258, he says, Muhammad was a carnal man, and he promised his followers carnal pleasures. And it says, you know, so it was not surprising that he was followed by carnal men and so forth. So his experience in his life is in 3 phases. The first phase is he was a religious leader in the pagan city of Mecca for 12 years. And he only makes about 70 converts in 12 years. And he gets a little frustrated. Nobody's converting. He's hanging around the Kaaba, the square building where the pagans worshipped all of their 360 different pagan gods. And he begins to get new verses from Allah to warn the pagans of judgment. And so he's disrupting their services and telling them that they're all going to burn in hell and all their ancestors are burning in hell. And they don't really like this. They sort of view Muhammad as being a little confrontational, argumentative, disruptive. And so the pagans decide to chase Muhammad out of town in the year 622 AD. And so he flees north 210 miles to a Jewish city called Medina. And the Jews were nice enough to let him in. This is year 1, by the way, in the Muslim calendar. So our year 1 is the year Jesus was born. The Muslims' year 1 is 622 AD. It's the flight, the Hijra, when Muhammad was chased out of Mecca to Medina. Now Medina had 3 Jewish tribes that controlled the politics of the city. And Muhammad goes to them and presents his faith, and they reject him. I mean, they were nice enough to let him into the city, but they rejected his faith. So he changes the direction of bowing from Jerusalem to Mecca. That's right, he originally had all his followers bowing toward Jerusalem, but when the Jews rejected him, he goes into the pagan neighborhoods and he bows toward the pagan city of Mecca. And a few pagans in Medina speak out against Muhammad, and they mysteriously get assassinated. And so the rest of the pagans figure they better follow him. And so he's sort of acting like a community organizer in this minority neighborhood in Medina, in the city that's controlled by the Jews. And so he gets a following. He goes back to the Jewish leaders and he presents himself as a candidate of change. He said, look, I'm a newcomer to this city. I can rise above this partisanship, this political, and I can be objective and fair. And so the Jews make a treaty with Muhammad and he becomes a political leader in Medina. So now he's a religious leader and he's a political leader. Then something happens. His followers back in Mecca get a little belligerent, argumentative, confrontational, and threatening, the way some of his followers are today. And they get chased out of town, and they go north to Medina, where Muhammad is. And Muhammad permits them to rob the caravans headed to Mecca in retaliation for the Meccans chasing them out of town. And so if you look at a map, there's the Mediterranean Sea in Cairo, and then there's the caravan routes that go through Medina and then to Mecca. And so in Medina, Muhammad had 300 soldiers and they would rob the caravans. He had a whole chapter of the Quran from Allah on how to distribute booty from robbing caravans. Surah 8, chapter 8. A man with no wife gets 1 portion, a man with a wife gets 2 portions, and so forth. And so so it's a little different than Christian thought, where Jesus said if they take your coat, give them your shirt. Muhammad said if they take your house, you retaliate, you take their caravan. And so he has these warriors, and in the year 624 AD, the Meccans send 1,000 soldiers to protect their caravan, and Muhammad with 300 defeats 1,000. And it's the Battle of Badr, B-A-D-R, Badr. And so Muhammad takes this amazing victory, having been outnumbered 3-1, as confirmation that Allah wants him to be a military leader. And Muhammad fights in 66 battles and raids in the next 8 years before he dies. He leads 27 of them. He even used the catapult when he attacked the city of Al-Taif. And when he was told the catapult was inadvertently killing innocent women and children, Muhammad's response was, they are among them, so they got to be killed too. So suicide bombers today say it's okay to kill innocent women and children to advance Islam because Muhammad did. And since he's the perfect Muslim, Muslims today that want to be better Muslims or more devout Muslims, they want to be like him religiously, politically, and militarily. And so that's why the more fundamentally they follow his example, the more they end up getting violent. Now, the year 627 AD, the Meccans send 10,000 soldiers to Medina to stop Muhammad from robbing their caravans. It's their last-ditch effort. Their economy is being crippled. And so in 627 AD, Muhammad's been out of town now for 5 years, out of Mecca. The Meccans get some pagans, some Jewish tribes, some different nomads, and they get this 10,000 coalition force, and they march toward Medina. Now Muhammad, as a religious leader, 70 converts in 12 years, that's nothing really outstanding. As a political leader, he was brilliant and able to play the different tribal politics in Medina to his advantage. But as a military leader, he was a genius. Why? He was very creative, very unconventional. He didn't play by the traditional rules of Arab warfare. And so, for example, the pagans had 1 month where they agreed not to fight. It was their pilgrimage month, and they would go to Mecca and worship at that square building, the Kaaba. And Muhammad gets verses from Allah telling him it's okay to rob the caravans during this pilgrimage month. And so he catches them totally by surprise and gets a lot of booty. And, well, his version of roadside bombs and IEDs was he dug potholes and trenches all around the city of Medina, which rendered the superior cavalry of the Meccans useless. You can't charge your horses and camels across a field full of potholes and trenches while you're being shot at. I mean, the horses will break their legs. And so it throws off the whole battle strategy. And then Muhammad bribes some of these tribes, and they leave in the night. He threatens some of the other tribes, and they leave in the night. Sort of Chicago politics, the bribe or the bullet. And then it gets freezing cold for a week, and the Meccans lose heart and decide to bring their troops home. And when the Meccans retreat and withdraw and bring their troops home, Muhammad considered this a great victory, that his enemies were cowards and they left. And so he's emboldened. And so he goes back into the city, the Jewish city of Medina, and he gets offended at one of the Jewish tribes, confiscates their property, and chases them out of town. He gets offended at the second Jewish tribe, confiscates their property, chases them out of town. Now this set a precedent in Islam called hudna. It's their word for treaty. It's when you're weak, you make treaties until you get strong enough to disregard them. So remember when he first came to Medina, he was this religious refugee fleeing, and the Jews were nice enough to let him in. And then he organizes, and then he goes to the Jews and he makes a treaty with the Jews. Now it's 5 years later, he just won the Battle of the Trench, and now he's strong, and he breaks the treaty with the Jews, confiscates their property, and chases them out. And so it's this precedent that when you're weak, you make treaties until you get strong enough to disregard them. So here we are twisting Israel's arm to make a treaty with the Muslims when their whole concept of treaty is to just restock missiles. Anyway, the third Jewish tribe in Medina, he bottles them in their neighborhood for 25 days. And when these Jews finally surrender, Muhammad brings them into the market and chops off their heads. 600 or 700 of them, and then he sells the women and children into slavery. Matter of fact, slavery was the #1 way that Islam was financed for over 1,400 years. They would castrate the men, make them eunuchs in their harem, and so forth. Anyway, this is what the Surat says. Now, there's 3 sources of literature for Islam. There's the Quran, which is private revelations to Muhammad. He's the only one that gets those. He's the expert on them, so that's the Quran. Then there's the Hadith. And the Hadith are stories remembered about Muhammad from his wives and warriors. And so after Muhammad died, they would say, I remember the Prophet did this or that. All those I remembers are put down. That's called the Hadith. Most of Sharia law comes from the Hadith. And then the third is the Surat, the biography of Muhammad, written about 100 years after his death. And that puts the whole thing in chronological order. If you were going to start off to study Islam, the first thing I would recommend is read the Surat, the biography. It's sort of the skeleton. And he puts it in, you know, first conquered Medina, and then he conquered Khaybar, and then he conquered Mecca, and so it sort of gives you a timeline to fill in. Well, this is what the Surat, the biography of Muhammad, says when he was in Medina with that third Jewish tribe. He says, after 25 days, the tribe surrendered, and Muhammad confined them in the quarter of Dul al-Harith in Medina. Then the apostle went out into the market of Medina and dug trenches in it. And then he sent for the Jews and struck off their heads in the trenches as they were brought out to him in batches. There were 600 or 700 in all, though some put the figure as high as 800 or 900. As they were being taken out in batches to the apostle, they asked Ka'b what he thought would be done with them. He replied, will you never understand? Don't you see the summoner never stops? And those who are taken away do not return. By Allah, it is death. This went on until the apostle made an end of them. Goes on to say, Zohair, an aged Jew who had saved some of Muhammad's allies, was interceded for and granted a pardon. But what hath become of our Jewish chiefs, Kab, Huey, Asa ibn Samuel? Asked the old man. As one after another he named the leading chiefs of the Jewish tribe, he received the reply that they had been slain already. Then of what use is life to me any longer? Slay me also, that I may join those who have preceded me. When this was told to Muhammad, he said, Yea, ye shall join them in the fire of hell, and he too was beheaded. And so this begins Muhammad's political career, and it's very effective. And so we see that his life went through these three stages: religious, political, military, RPM, like on your car, revolutions per minute, you know, RPM, religious, political, military. And if we look at it a little closer, that the first phase, he was a religious immigrant to Medina, right? He's chased out of Mecca, and he goes to Medina, and he's a religious immigrant, a refugee. And the Jews are nice enough to let him into their city as an immigrant. And then he goes into the minority neighborhoods and begins to make converts. And so he increases the number of his followers. So he's immigrated, he's increased, and then he eliminates. So 5 years after coming to a Jewish city, there's not a Jew left in the city. They've either been driven out, killed, or enslaved. And so, you know, Caesar's 3 steps was Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. Muhammad's was immigrate, increase, and eliminate. And so this pattern of immigrating, increasing, and eliminating has been used for 1,400 years. And we look at Europe. We can see it in progress as we go on. Europe is an interesting study. Western Europe used to all be Catholic, and then the Protestant Reformation in 1517, and then it always had remnants of Jews. And the Jewish neighborhoods were called ghettos, that's the term. And so all of Europe was basically Judeo-Christian. Now, they didn't always live up to it, and they had terrible wars, but they had these verses that be nice to the stranger because you were once a stranger in Egypt, and do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And you're all equal, made in the image of God. Book of Genesis, in the image of God he created male and female. Did they live up to those all the time? No, they had terrible wars, but they were always there to bother their conscience. Well, then Europe went to neutral. Like a car goes from drive into neutral before it goes into reverse. Europe went from Judeo-Christian to secular. How? Well, the French Revolution. Voltaire, mocking with his brilliant wit, sort of like some of these nightly news programs, you know, or these comedy shows. Voltaire was mocking Christianity, and this had us, was the seedbed for the French Revolution. And then Robespierre, one of the key leaders of the French Revolution, he sticks a prostitute in Notre Dame Cathedral, covers her with a sheet, and says, this is the goddess of reason, let's worship her. And so they have all this French infidelity and immorality, and then Napoleon spreads it all around Europe. And so Europe becomes secular. That's the main ideology in Europe after this time. It's secular. And so Europe went from Judeo-Christian to secular. Now, the theme song for secular Europe could, in a sense, be John Lennon's Imagine. You know the song, Imagine There's No Heaven, It's Easy If You Try. And then a line in there that says, nothing to kill and die for and no religion too. So think of it, once you've got rid of religion and you have this secular utopia of Europe, nobody's going to defend it, right? And they've lost their ability to discriminate. They can't say, well, there's nothing special about Judeo-Christian stuff anymore. Bring in whatever. And so all these other beliefs come into Europe, and now Sharia law Islam is coming in, slamming the car into reverse, saying Jews are apes and pigs, you can beat your wife and you can kill the infidel. And so the Europeans are waking up thinking, how did we get here where there are 700 neighborhoods around Paris that have been completely taken over by Muslims? You see, Europe's very socialist. The government pays for their health care, welfare, and retirement. But the Europeans are having fewer kids plus abortion. So who's going to work the jobs to pay the taxes to support all these retirees? Well, they need immigrants to come in and work. They open the doors. 70% of immigrants into Europe are Muslim, 50 million of them, and they're having, on the average, 8 kids per family. In 20 years, there will be 100 million Muslims in Europe, and they will dominate the politics. And so let's look at these 700 neighborhoods in Paris. How did the Muslims take it over? Well, immigrate, increase, and eliminate. The first ones come in as religious immigrants. And they're nice. And they're genuinely nice. And most of them don't see the whole picture. They just individually like being there and want to enjoy the freedoms. And what do people say? They're nice. I met a Muslim, they're nice. And so they're so nice, what do they decide? Let more in. More Muslims come in and they get a community. And they get an imam who teaches them to follow the Quran closer. And they build a mosque and they start having the women wear the veils and the burqas. And as they make their presence more visible, people think, hey, this neighborhood's changing, maybe this is the time to move out. And as they move out, more Muslims move in, and then finally that's when violence takes place and there's no witnesses. Because no Muslim will testify against another Muslim on behalf of an infidel, a kafir. And so the Muslims immigrate, they increase, and they eliminate 700 neighborhoods around Paris. If you've seen the YouTube videos of them blocking the streets and stopping traffic while they're doing their bowing to prayer. The #1 name given to newborns in London, England is Mohammed. Almost all of southern Netherlands, Holland, is Moroccan Muslim. The #1 growing crime in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark is rape. Muslim immigrant men raping European women. Why? Because Muhammad permitted his men to rape the women they took in battle. 10 years ago there were 3 mosques in Germany. Today they're building 200. I was in Berlin last year, and you cannot go anywhere in Berlin without seeing Turkish women with their veils on and their little boys, because Islamic law says that a woman cannot leave her house without a male relative. And so they have their little boys with them. And 10% of Berlin is Turkish Muslim. They came in as guest workers during the Cold War, decided to stay and have lots of kids. And they fill up stadiums, and the president of Turkey comes up and says, you're not supposed to assimilate, don't learn the German language, you're here to take over. And so just a couple months ago, Angela Merkel, the president of Germany, said multiculturalism has failed. She says that you should not come here unless you're going to learn our German language and embrace our Christian ethics. That's what she called it. And so Europe is changing, and it's changing through the 3 steps: immigrate, increase, and eliminate. And it works, it's very effective. And so we see this as a concern for people in America because of our administration and the attitude that we're taking. Now the word Islam means submission, submission to the will of Allah. And a Muslim is one who has submitted to the will of Allah. And Islam is a religion of peace. Their definition of peace is when the whole world submits to the will of Allah, there will be peace. In other words, world peace means world Islam. So it's sort of like, you know, Bill Clinton, what's the definition of is, so we need to look at what the definition of these words are, right? So our definition of the word peace is different groups that don't believe the same thing learning how to get along. The Islamic definition of peace is when the whole world submits to the will of Allah, then there'll be peace. When Islam's enemies are defeated, there's peace. And so when they say they want to have a roadmap for peace with Israel, it's a roadmap to have Israel submit to Allah. And when they say, well, it's the religion of peace, their goal is to have the whole world become Muslim and then there'll be peace. Now, what about moderate Muslims? There's lots of moderate Muslims. A moderate Muslim believes the world will submit to Allah later. Maybe at the end of the world. Maybe it's figurative. And since it's so far off in the distant future, just get along with the kafir, the infidel. That's fine. That type of Muslim just wants to live their life and have their family, and you know, they go to the mosque, but they want to do basically as little as they can, and it's not occupying a prominent spot in their life that they want to bring the world into submission to Allah. They just want to live their life. That's fine. That type of Muslim can live in a free democratic society. The fundamental Muslim, on the other hand, thinks the world is submitting to Allah now. And they're really excited and they want to help make it happen. Now the dilemma for the West is the more we bend over backwards in unprecedented ways to show ourselves tolerant of Islam, the more the moderate Muslim begins to rethink and say, wait a second, this has never happened before. Maybe the world is actually submitting to Allah now rather than later. And so they gravitate from the future peaceful moderate camp into the fundamental now camp, which is the violent camp. So in a sense, all of our efforts to show ourselves really, really, really tolerant are backfiring. You know, it's sort of like, you know, Condoleezza Rice goes to Israel and says, look, if you just give away the Gaza Strip, you know, and do this, then finally you'll have peace. And so these Jews think, okay, we'll finally bend over really far, give away this nice prime piece of property, and, you know, and what happened? They just restocked missiles closer to Israel. You know, they view it, it's sort of like, you know, international politics is the law of the jungle. You show weakness, you invite aggression. You know, I liken it to your alma mater, your football team in high school. Let's say every year after you graduate, your football team loses. you become a peaceful fan. You become passive. Matter of fact, you're embarrassed of your team, you know? And so you don't get excited about them. But let's say they start winning. They start winning games. They're written up in the newspaper, and they got these star players, and boy, they're going to be drafted, and they're winning the regionals and district, and they're winning the state championship. All of a sudden, you find that old jersey in the bottom drawer, you put it on again, you know, you call some old classmates, and you get excited. And then you go to the state final game, and boy, the stadium's packed out, and some are so excited, they paint their face and put cheese on their head if they're in Wisconsin, you know. And they get radicalized as they see their team advancing. And so that's the same way it is with Islam. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire was defeated and they became peaceful. And then after 1938, when oil was discovered in Saudi Arabia and we began to pump money over there, they became wealthy. Now they're on a roll. Now they see their team winning, you know, and we look at what's happening in the world. Now, I want to give you a little bit of a historical background, and I go through it a whole lot in the book and the DVD. The two waves of Islamic expansion. Muhammad dies in the year 632 AD. And within 100 years of his death, Muslims conquer Egypt. Egypt is in the news today. Egypt was almost completely Christian for 6 centuries. It was started by Mark, that wrote the Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Coptic Christian. The word Coptic is the Egyptian word for Egyptian. The problem was the Byzantine Christians from Constantinople were persecuting the Coptic Christians in Egypt. And the Muslims come along and say, hey, we're sort of like you, we'll help you drive out those Byzantines. And the Coptics are like, yeah, it can't get any worse than it is. Sure, come on in. The Muslims come in, and they drive out the Byzantines, and then they decide to stay. And then they decide that not just was their religion superior, their language was. And so they cut out the tongues of anybody caught speaking Egyptian. And there's stories of piles of tongues in different towns where they cut them out. So that's why they speak Arabic today in Egypt. And then they decided that their culture was superior to the Egyptians. And so the Muslims destroy the pyramids. They destroy the Egyptian temples. Right? We have archaeologists going over and saying, you know, where's Pharaoh's tomb? That's because the Muslims had destroyed it. Sort of like, remember those Buddha statues that were in the mountainside in Afghanistan? And the Taliban wanted to blow them up? And National Geographic's like having a fit because they, you know, well, why? Because anything before Islam is pagan. Remember in January 2011 when they're having the riots in Cairo? I don't know if you saw it in the news. They broke into the museum and they destroyed mummies. Why would they do that? That's because it was pagan, right? It was before Muhammad. Anyway, then Muslims conquered Jerusalem under Caliph Umar. And Jerusalem had been a Christian city for 3 centuries, since Constantine. Right? His mother, St. Helena, goes down there and builds all these cathedrals where Christ's passion took place. Then Muslims conquer Hebron, and they turn the Cave of the Patriarchs into a mosque, and then they conquer Syria. Syria was the first country to completely be Christian in 265 AD. There are more ancient Christian writings in the Syrian language than any other language other than Greek and Latin. And the Muslims invade under Caliph Umar, and Khalid ibn al-Walid was the Muslim general. The guy was brilliant. He was undefeated in over 100 battles. Khalid ibn al-Walid was nicknamed the Drawn Sword of Allah. And he would do these pincer movements and these lightning-fast terrorist attacks and capture and destroy Byzantine armies and Persian armies. I mean, he was unbeatable. One of the reasons was this military invention called the stirrup. How many of you are in horses? Right? You put your feet in these things called stirrup. Do you know who invented the stirrup? Mongolian nomads over by China. They'd have little short horses, and they'd tie a rope around the horse and leave 2 loops hanging for their big toes because they would ride barefoot. It would help them keep balance, and they would raid into China. Well, then the Chinese learned how to make stirrups, but they would make them bigger so you could put your whole foot in there. And that invention made its way across the Gobi Desert over to Persia, the China Silk Road, and the Persians made them out of metal with leather straps. And this invention, this improvement of the stirrup, allowed you to fight in the saddle and put the full power of a galloping horse behind a sword, a scimitar sword, those curved swords. And they were made out of Damascus steel, very light. So you could hold the reins with one hand, and they literally could slice somebody in half while riding with the other hand. And so the Muslims had this, it was like AK-47s versus, you know, muskets. It was like F-16s. I mean, these were like cutting-edge military technology that they had first. And they used it, and they're lightning fast. Then they conquered North Africa. There used to be 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa in the 7th century. Morocco, Algiers, Tunisia. Tunisia was Carthage, that's where St. Augustine was from. Tripoli, Libya, that was all Christian. It's all in the news today. It's not Christian anymore because the Muslims conquered it. And they wiped out not just the Christian and the Jewish faith there, but they also wiped out 7 centuries of Greco-Roman tradition. And because their culture was superior, not just superior to the Egyptians, but superior to the Greeks and the Romans. Then in the year 711, they invade Spain. Now just like the Coptics were being persecuted by the Byzantines and they let the Muslims in, the political division, and just like when Muhammad went into Medina and the political division between these tribes, well, there was a political division in Spain. Spain was Visigothic Christian, another version of Christianity, and one kingdom was being attacked by another kingdom. So one of these kingdoms gets the bright idea to go across the Strait of Gibraltar, gather these Muslim hordes and bring them across to help their side. Well, the Muslims, 80,000 of them, come across the Strait of Gibraltar and they say, you know what, while we're here, we might as well just conquer the whole thing. And so they conquer all of Spain in 10 years. Thousands die. Then they cross the Pyrenees Mountains and they conquer southern France. And you read the story of like the Battle of